The way I view college athletics today, it's like a big pyramid scheme. And one of these days, one of those blocks at the bottom of that pyramid is going to collapse, and the whole thing is going to come down. And I think we're getting closer to that all the time because the demands and the payouts are getting to be really ridiculous.
Some conversations were never meant to be recorded. This one was. Dick Schultz, University of Iowa basketball coach, ran the NCAA, and led the United States Olympic Committee. Kevin Crampton, author of Tuned, former CEO, who has led billion-dollar deals around the globe and credits Dick as his greatest mentor.
Sometimes life, you get out of tune.
If you keep your focus in the right place, and then life will become a true adventure for you.
In a world moving faster than ever, it's easy to lose rhythm. These conversations help you find it again.
The A and B students all end up working for the C students.
This is not a masterclass. This is not a playbook. It's just real talk from two men who have done it. Welcome to Tune Talks.
One of the key things that I'd like to talk a little bit about, Dick, is the importance of always learning new things. I mean, we talked about earlier, if you want to stay in tune, given the world around you is constantly changing, you better be ahead on the learning curve, constantly learning new things, challenging yourselves. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about that in your life and how you've kind of continued to learn things.
Done so many different things, 3 major U.S. universities, plus the NCAA and the Olympics. There was change at every one of those jobs. A different philosophy, different part of the country, different traditions, and then with the NCAA and the Olympics, the NCAA was adjusting the organization to the needs of the members, and the Olympics, there were some big changes you had to make there, the political issues, the international issues. So change was a big part of my life. And so because of that, I think change was easier for me than it was for a lot of people, because I knew when I went into a new situation, there was going to be, even though it was one university or different university, philosophies are different, traditions are different, funding is different. So I had to be prepared to make all the local adjustments to a new part of the country to live in, and just the living conditions. For example, one minor example, the University of Iowa, if you wanted to listen to the evening news, you tuned in at 10 o'clock. At Cornell University in New York, if you want to listen to the evening news, you had to tune in at 11 o'clock.
Right.
So you had time adjustments there, because in the East Coast, prime time is 9 to 12, believe it or not. And in Virginia, the adjustment was made is that we had a lot of basketball games that didn't start till 9 o'clock because the carrier wanted to have them in prime time because the ad rates were much higher in prime time.
And prime time's Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Prime time is Eastern Standard Time. So that just the difference of the time zones was one thing. And then going to the NCAA, our home and office was in Kansas City, Kansas. And as soon as you crossed the street from my office, you were in Missouri. Everybody that lived in that area would always, when they had to have their gas tank filled, would drive a couple blocks across the street to get to Missouri because the state tax was a lot lower.
Right.
But going from a public institution like the University of Iowa, with at that time about 25,000 students, to Cornell University, a quasi-private and public university, there were some major adjustments to make there, because you had the total enrollment there was about 15,000, 16,000. And the private university was on this half of the campus, the west half of the campus, and the state schools, the land grant schools, were on the east side. Now they were joined together. You didn't know when you left one to go to the other. And they were managed, the whole Cornell University was managed by the private side. Well, one of the big changes, there was a big difference in tuition, for example. If you went to the private school, your tuition was going to be at that time just your tuition, and this was in 1975. The tuition just took a big jump. It was about $10,000-$12,000 a year, and financial aid was based on need for athletes or non-athletes, and so that was one issue. But if you had a student that wanted to be in agriculture or architecture, they were enrolled in the state school, and the tuition was about half the cost of the private school. And for a good number of years, if you were a student and you, let's say, enrolled in the architecture school or the veterinary college, whatever it was on that side, and then you decided that really wasn't for you, you wanted engineering, you had to pay the difference between what you had paid to the state school, the private school, to make that adjustment. Now my understanding, they've eliminated that. You can go back and forth as much as you want to. You just pay whichever fee is appropriate. And then, of course, with a private university, you suddenly have the alumni days in the spring were big business, because they'd have the classes would come back and they would honor 5-year classes, 10-year classes, 20 and 25-year classes, and they would create class competition, see which class was going to present the biggest amount of money to the university, because it was all basically private funded, or in large cases endowed professorships that were funded by institutions and so forth. And when I went to Cornell, they had a major campaign going, and it was basically to update buildings. They had all these buildings that were given to them by alumni, and the buildings were there, and they had to maintain the buildings, but they didn't have the resources to do that. So they did two things. They had a major campaign of about, I think, 50 or 60 million at that time. It was strictly for maintenance, and then any new building, the building was going to be 25 million to build. You also had to set aside an amount of money for the maintenance of that building.
Right.
And then, of course, in the Ivy League and all the private institutions, 50 million seemed like a lot then, but now they have a campaign that might be for 1 billion or 2 billion or $3 billion. But that's for the private school. That's really important. That's their livelihood. So there were all kinds of adjustments like that were made, and a different way of recruiting and a different way of maintaining athletes and facilities and so forth. And the time I went to Cornell, it was the first year of the enforcement of Title IX.
Right.
And Cornell had a huge athletic program, and it was a program that started on the women's side by just saying, we don't need to have the funding and the money that football and basketball has. We just want to be recognized as a varsity sport. But then by the time Title IX came around, they wanted money. And so we had this big athletic department of all these sports, including polo and squash and bowling and things like that. And then the traditional sports. And the athletic department was bankrupt. They just hadn't closed the door. So the big change I had to make there was I had to become a major fundraiser.
So you're a bit ahead of your time here, because as you look more and more as people are appointed to that athletic director role, the days of the ex-coaches are becoming less and less, and more so, what's your resume on fundraising? So not that the athletic piece of it is not important in understanding how that works, but all of a sudden that is the person that's the deputy that's handling all of that. And the AD's role is really primarily fundraising, dealing with outside interests because of the money requirements to feed all the mouths that you have to feed now.
Yeah, it used to be in the 70s. The athletic director many times was just the retired football coach.
Right.
And they weren't business people. But now you have very few football or basketball coaches that are moving into athletic director positions. That's pretty much a thing of the past. They're either attorneys or business people or someone like that, because the challenge of running an athletic program anymore at a major university has changed dramatically. And you're operating a multi-million-dollar business,
right?
And you better know what you're doing. And of course, that was the big change at Cornell. And then when I went to Virginia, I was back more in my original element of being at the university with full scholarships and scholarship based on athletic skill and things like this. But one of the big adjustments I had to make was living in the South and living in Virginia and being aware of the fact that there was still a lot of racial issues involved in different parts of the state. And in Virginia, it was like living in 3 different states. You're at the University of Virginia. It was pretty close to D.C., and you had more of the people there who were like people living in D.C. If you went to Southwest Virginia, they were basically coal miners, and they talked a different language, and they had a dialect that you had to learn and listen to, because when I say the language is different, it was still English, but it was English language you weren't used to hearing. And then you went to Southeast Virginia, down on the shores and so forth, and it was a different culture. So you had about 3 different cultures, and then you put Richmond in the middle of that with all the Civil War history that was there, and the Grand Avenue, every block had a big statue of a former Confederate officer on his horse with his sword up.
Right.
And now recently, they've torn down a lot of those because of racial issues and racial pressure. So you had that whole type of culture you had to make an adjustment to. Plus in Virginia, it wasn't like a state university, even though Virginia was a state university. The academic requirements were high. And at that time, it wasn't much redshirting because you were expected to graduate in 4 years. And if you didn't graduate in 4 years and you wanted the 5th year there, you had to have a pretty sound, logical reason to do that. And for example, Ralph Sampson graduated in 4 years.
Yeah. And you gave me the pleasure of introducing me to Ralph at a Final Four, which Virginia won that year, by the way. And my Spartans fell a little short. And I can attest, Ralph's still 7 feet 4 inches tall.
Yeah.
So at that time when Ralph was there at Virginia, that was, that surpassed the Chamberlains of the world. And the expectations were extremely high. So how do you help someone, because I know that you and your wife were close to Ralph, how do you help someone who gets thrust into such high expectations at such a young age, where if you're not winning national championships and you're not dominating, if you're not as good or better than Chamberlain or Jabbar, you're kind of viewed as coming up short. How do you kind of help someone along with that?
First of all, you need to have a coach who has really a lot of stability and a lot of thoughtfulness. And we were fortunately, we had Terry Holland, who was an outstanding coach, but a great individual. And he had the ability to handle Ralph and the challenges he had. But there were a lot of challenges there because of the fact that he became the National Player of the Year his sophomore season, and he played in several Final Fours. And every year, the big question from the media was, is Ralph going to leave or is he going to stay? And it would come down and he would stay. And I remember at the end of his junior year, when he had just finished a great year, Sports Illustrated could not believe that he would not go out.
Mm-hmm.
And when he decided not to go out, they actually sent a reporter down and interviewed his family, and his mother was really strong. And I'll never forget the comments he made, because he was, in effect, the reporter was saying, as a parent, how could you not discourage him from going back to university with all the money he will make if he went out? And she says, young man, let me tell you something. You can play basketball, and that's fine, but your education is the most important thing you have. And your education makes you free.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. You know, he had strong family support, which was not always the case of some of the top athletes.
Right.
And we gave him a lot of support, and he needed a lot of tutoring help in some areas. And but we did all that, and he finished his 4 years in Virginia and graduated with his class, was respected by the student body. One of the famous areas in the University of Virginia is called the Lawn, and that was the original university with the rotunda on one end, and then they had these low buildings on each side of this big grassy area. And then every so often here was a two-story structure, and then it would go on. Well, those low buildings were very small rooms that housed the students. And the two rooms, the faculty member lived upstairs and the classes were downstairs. Well, they still use those facilities, and you're selected by the student body. They pick the people that they think deserve to be living in the Lawn, which is a great deal, even though they're small buildings. Some of them had a fireplace, and that was the heat, and you had to go out and down and around to take a shower or go to the restroom. So they were not classy, but they were part of Thomas Jefferson's original university. Well, Sampson was selected to live on the Lawn, and he tried it for about 2 weeks, and it was just too tiny for him.
Yeah, probably bumping his
handle it.
head.
So he finally moved out. But there was those kind of traditions, and then like the military academies, the university had a honor code that had to be respected, and the students could charge somebody violating the honor code, and they had their own judicial system and so forth, and that happened. We had a couple athletes at one time or another had to make an appearance on honor code violations, and so the traditions that you inherit are things you have to make a quick adjustment to. And I had a friend of Cornell that grew up in Virginia and gave me a good piece of advice. He said, people think that a lot of Virginia people are stuck up and don't want anything to do with new people. He says, that's not right. He says they protect the privacy of the individual, but he said if you will open the conversation and go with them, they'll be great friends, but they will not make the move to create that themselves. It'll have to come from you.
Right.
Because of their privilege of privacy they have. So that was the big adjustment at Virginia. And then, of course, the NCAA and the Olympics that were more of a corporate adjustment.
Yeah. How about going back your athletic director days, and you have student athletes there, and you were talking about tuition, and one of the things over the last several decades is tuition has gone up so much higher than the rate of inflation, to the point that in my day I could, through summer jobs and doing a little work during the school year, I could pay for my tuition and still not take on a huge student loan burden. That's not necessarily true today. And then because of that, or in part because of that, I think you've seen also both parents and students become much more vocational in their selection of majors, because nobody wants to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to find out that they can't find a job, or they're working at a barista at Starbucks or whatever after making that kind of investment. So you're starting to see more and more a vocational focus. Like, I have to pick a major that provides me the opportunity for employment, be it I want to be an engineer, or I want to be a computer scientist, or I want to be a doctor, or whatever, or I want to be a business major, which has created problems, I know, on the university board that I served on, and I think in some of the other ones, and you probably could understand this too at the places you were, where all of a sudden you have a mismatch of faculty and who have a certain expertise, and then the marketplace has shifted to more of these vocationally focused majors, and then how do you deal with that? Because I learned that there were 6 different groups that thought they ran the university, and the board was only one of those groups. And so you have situations today where being vocational and being very careful in selecting a major so that it provides not only a return on investment, but the opportunity to earn a living, which is important. How do you think about that, the vocational type approach and the cost, and how should people think about college today? I know some have even debated, is it worth going to college? And you spent your professional career, most of your professional career, in colleges and universities. And so today people are doubting the benefit of that, and is it worth that expenditure?
Yeah. There's 2 sides of that equation. There's, the challenge of getting the right major and be productive in it. And you have to be a little bit cautious in dealing with athletes with that, because too many times at universities, the conviction is, well, this person majors in basketball or football, and you put them in programs that are never going to be valuable to them just to keep them eligibility. So they're really majoring eligibility.
Right.
And you have to be careful with that. So there has to be good guidance. And the other thing you have to remember is that more than 50% of the students that declare a major when they start in college change that major at least once or twice. Maybe somebody will say, well, I want to be a doctor. And so they get into some pre-med studies and this is not for me. I don't want anything to do with that. Or I want to be an engineer. And they find out once they get into the details, it doesn't work. Too many times they'll look at the profession from the outside and say, well, these people are making a lot of money. I'm going to major in that.
Right.
And then they get into it and it's not what they want. So you have to work pretty closely with those students and be sure they're in programs that they like, because if you are putting them where you want them to be, they don't have the motivation then to be effective students.
Right.
So you have to get them in programs that are meaningful, programs that they really will work hard at because there's motivation. I like this, and so on and so forth. And so the simplest way to deal with the eligibility problem of athletes is get them into programs that are productive, that they like, and they can see how this will have great potential for them if they don't become a professional player.
Yeah, how do you deal with, the thing that's changed radically since I was a high schooler is these, not only have you had the evolution, let's take basketball, where before it was your high school basketball coach that was in many cases the meaningful and maybe most influence on you. Now it may be your AAU coach, that because you're spending in a lot of cases more time playing AAU ball than you are high school ball. And then you have the situation where it's evolved. It started first in sports like tennis, where you had the academies down in Florida, and now you have the IMG Academy, where all of a sudden it's not just the best, but it's many kids who are becoming specialized athletes with huge investments based on the premise of being a Division I athlete, with the further premise that they have a chance to play professionally. And as you and I know, there's only so many spots, and therefore the likelihood of that investment being a good investment is extremely low. As I think I mentioned earlier, you might be better off taking that amount of money your parents are spending and buying lottery tickets every week, and you may have a better chance at hitting it. So you have a situation where, in many cases, athletes are prioritizing year-round sports specialization, and in many of these specialized high schools, it is kind of eligibility focused. They're not there studying physics and high-end math and all that, and so, but they're not going to be pros either.
Yeah.
And so, do you create an expectation that's likely to be unfulfilled, and then therefore students who didn't get the kind of educational benefit that will give them something that they could call on with a future career, all of a sudden, because they didn't really do that. They did major in staying eligible. They didn't take the kind of rigorous academic courses, but they're very disciplined in their sport. But all of a sudden, they're not playing pro, and like all except 1/10 of 100% won't be. So, are we leading? And maybe I'm not saying we leading, but is this going down a path that kind of ends in tears, where people wake up and say, boy, that was a foolish investment, and I didn't prepare my kids for a future that's going to require skills, right? More and more, you're going to have a skill set. And even if you don't go to college, you better be an electrician or a plumber or an HVAC specialist.
I think we've gone through that, and I see some changes taking place. And I'm not sure I really like that. But when I started the University of Iowa in 1960, we had a lot of athletes that played two sports. We had football players that played baseball and basketball players that played baseball, or maybe they were in track and field in the off season. As the years went on, sports became so specialized that even high school kids were focusing on one sport and one sport only, where they used to maybe play two or something like that. And the parents were a part of that problem, because they could see where maybe their child had good skills and he might maybe make a lot of big money like the pros are. So we're going to spend some money getting him trained by the best experts so he can be really a good player, good football player, or a good basketball player. And so many of those came into school with false expectations that they could never reach. And sometimes they didn't even play a lot at the collegiate level, let alone becoming a professional athlete. And I think as the years have gone by, the recruiting is much more professional. And now, especially in the sport of football and basketball, a lot of programs are not worried whether that athlete graduates or not, because so many of them are leaving early to go into the pros, especially in basketball, that it's frustrating for the coaches to try to plan a program for them, and then they play 1 year and they're good enough, they get drafted and they're gone. And so a lot of the top schools now, and we started this at the NCAA with our foundation, that money in that foundation went to athletes who completed their eligibility but hadn't graduated yet. And through that foundation, they could complete their degree by coming back to school and taking the courses they needed to take. And you're seeing more universities start to do things like that. But it's a fine line, Kevin, a very fine line. And it starts with the parents. The parents build up expectations for their children that are completely out of line, and that fouls up the expectation of the children, and they want to please their parents, and they can't because they're not being successful, and that creates child-parent challenges and frustrations and a lot of challenges at the college level. So you have to really be careful when it comes to building expectations and in recruiting. You know, I never promised an athlete that he was going to be a starter, but a lot of coaches say you come here and you can start and you can be a starter your first year.
And then what do you do today when, if you don't promise you're going to be a starter, that person says, okay, I'm in the transfer portal tomorrow?
Yeah. College athletics needs to be first class and devoted to the welfare of the athlete and not be selfish thinking and put them in situations where they can't succeed academically, but they can stay eligible to play.
What I find interesting is that when I grew up, we were encouraged to do multiple things. You know, we were seasonal sports people, learn a whole bunch of different things. And then now there's a focus on specialization in sport, specialization, be it in vocation. But what's happening now, if you look at the trends, be it AI and things of that nature, it's creating an unpredictability as to is that future and that specialization even going to exist? So it almost is demanding of you to be good at pivoting, to be good at learning new things, because you may wake up in that engineering major, even though that it seems smart at the time, might not be relevant tomorrow, or there may be new things. And so unless you're very good at doing a whole bunch of different things, learning different things, you might not be equipping yourself for the world in the future. Whereas at the same time, we're telling our athletes and we're telling many of our students, you better be specialized, and the best is to specialize early as possible and be the best that you can. Maybe that's short-sighted. I don't know.
Well, you know, one of the worst things that happened was when athletes sued the NCAA on the transfer rules. At the present time, if they don't put a lid on it, you can transfer anytime you want to. So you have people that are there and they're not playing as much as they wanted to. They just drop out of school and transfer someplace else. There was a young man at a major university that finished his eligibility. He played for 5 different schools in 5 years. And so they just try to move around where they can make the most money or where they'll be able to play more. And that's a real fallacy. That just leads to a lot of indecision and putting yourself in a situation where you not only can't excel and succeed athletically the way you want to, you've blown your opportunities to get a degree and have something that will be with you for a lifetime.
Right, because even the students that participate professionally, usually these careers are very short.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's not like you're making lifetime money. Even if you make it to the professional ranks, unless you're one of the handful of superstars, you're not going to make money in what the average NFL career is a few years, NBA career a few years. you're not making enough lifetime money. So what are you going to do next? And not everybody can go into broadcasting. One of the things I was curious about, and I was listening, one local sportscaster pointed this out, that in the state of Michigan, you have Detroit Pistons, of course, and then you have the Michigan State and University of Michigan, and this year both great basketball programs. But then you have the G League team, which probably could beat both of them. You have this anomaly, whereas the G League team, which is probably better than the college team, doesn't draw, doesn't pay their athletes what these colleges can pay. So you have this unique situation where fans are spending a lot of money because they feel some kind of affiliation with the university. And so it's not just they're supporting the best athletes because they should be going to the G League games, but they're supporting their local colleges. Is there a risk that special relationships that fans identified with their university and athletes that became student athletes as part of the university radically changes as college sports become a bunch of mercenaries? And as you mentioned, a kid might have 5 different schools. Yeah. How do you, and at the same time, you have athletic directors asking for ever more money. How do you kind of maintain the fans' interest in that, in some cases, a rabid affiliation to their university and supporting the sports of their university, where all of a sudden they don't even know who the players are next year, and in many cases may not even know anybody on the starting team for the following season because everybody left or everybody's new?
Fans are interested. Some are really interested in the individual and seeing the individual be successful. Most fans just want to see the team be successful.
Right.
And whatever the coach has to do to win is fine with them. And if he loses, then we need to get a new coach who can do the things he needs to do to win. And this can impact the university, and it can impact the individual player too. So it's something that I think right now is completely out of control, and I'm not sure that there hasn't been a lot of damage done already to universities and to coaches and to athletes. Athletes are referring to lawsuits all the time, and it's not necessarily the athlete, but here's an attorney out here who says, hey, I can make up some big bucks if this goes, so I'll find a couple of athletes that I can use to stimulate a lawsuit and go after the universities and the sports programs of the NCAA. And that's one of the things that's happened. There's been 2 or 3 athletes at the most that have started these lawsuits, and then as they progress, others will join it if they see that there's a possibility of this being a payoff. But those lawsuits have just taken all authority away from the NCAA. Every time they try to do something, some files a lawsuit. They've done it on the transfer rule, they've done it on the payments, they've done it on just about every issue that's there, and they're finding judges that are sympathetic.
How do you make the college athletics business model work? So, and it's like any business model. So you have your revenue sources. So you have, and you were very good at this at the NCAA when I think you were instrumental in that first big Final Four agreement. So you're already probably close to maximizing the TV revenue sources. That's been mined over the last several years. So, and your ticket prices in many cases have gone up even higher than tuition in terms of a percentage. So you've been mining high ticket prices, and you've been asking alumni, sometimes in the case of collectives and things like that, to fund name, image, and likeness. And now you have a legal framework in which you're going to give 20-some million dollars to athletes, probably most of which is football and basketball, but you're going to have to spread that around a bit, and that there'll be tremendous pressure to share that with a wider group of people, right? Even though it may not be justified if it was a pure business decision. So if the demands for increased revenue continue, where is that revenue going to come from? TV, maybe not much more. How are you going to, alumni, maybe not much more, fans, maybe not much more. The students are paying record tuition, so you can't jack up tuition. So where do the resources come from to fund ever-growing, demands for athletic payments and facilities?
The way I view college athletics today, it's like a big pyramid scheme. And one of these days, one of those blocks at the bottom of that pyramid is going to collapse, and the whole thing is going to come down. Right. And I think we're getting closer to that all the time, because the demands and the payouts are getting to be really ridiculous, and there isn't going to be much more places, like you say, where they can go. They're trying to play more football games, trying to play more basketball games, playing almost as many football games now as the pros.
Right.
Basketball, there used to be a limit of 25 games a year. Now you've got teams that are playing games in the 40s. That's not necessarily in the best interest of the players. But I really view this as a problem, and I think it's just building and building and building, and just like the pyramid scheme, pretty soon you're here, and the weight is so heavy, the foundation starts falling apart, and then boom, then maybe we'll get back to pure amateur athletics again.
Now, do you end up maybe with a bifurcated structure where you have maybe one or two super conferences, which are the schools that are very wealthy, big wealthy alumni bases, maybe traditional strength in football, almost kind of like you see the Premier League in soccer in Europe, where there's a group of very rich and then everybody else is poor.
Yeah.
Do you think you're going to, is there a risk, and it sounds like more and more the power's shifting in the case away from the NCAA to these super conferences, the SEC now, the Big Ten, and do they continue to grow, and then all of a sudden it's just a group of kind of haves, and then everybody else has very little? Because we already see, if you're a good player in a strong mid-major, you ain't staying.
Yeah.
You're gone. You're playing for Alabama the next year, or you're playing for Michigan the next year.
We're seeing that already. Where we used to have 15 or 20 conferences in Division I, we have 5 major conferences now. And if you're not in one of those conferences with this new court settlement, you're out of luck. You're not going to have the big revenue you'll get. If you play in the basketball tournament, you'll get your share from that, and you'll get your gate receipts and so forth. But you're not going to get the big TV dollars.
Right.
You're not going to be in the football playoffs. You'll be able to still stay, at least as it stands today, in the basketball tournament. But they're adding 2 more teams now, so that tournament's expanding, and the more they expand, the less revenue there is to share individually with schools. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think it could very well lead to a professional league of college athletes.
Mm-hmm. And then truly become kind of the minor leagues for the professional franchises. Why don't we switch over and talk about risk-taking? So a lot of people are fearful of taking risk and take very few, if any, risks. Or, on the other end of the spectrum, they're emotional risk takers or or very spontaneous risk takers and don't really think through the impact or potential impact of taking a risk. How have you approached risk taking during your career? How do you approach taking on a risk? How do you think through that?
There always is, I think, an element of risk taking, either in business or in athletics. I was a high school coach for 10 years, and I offered this job as freshman basketball coach at the University of Iowa. I didn't make as much in that job as I was making as a high school coach, and I still had to move. But I thought, I'm as far as I can go in the high school. If I want to stay in this business, I'm going to have to do this and take the risk that I'm doing with my family and moving them for less money. And I'm not sure that I will ever be more than the freshman basketball coach at the University of Iowa. So that was a risk I took that paid off. And there's been a number of those along the way. I think if there's going to be risks we're going to have to take, but we need to be sure that we're taking that risk for the right reason. And if it doesn't work out, okay, fine. I wanted to do this, but it didn't develop the way I wanted to. At least you have that. But if you take a risk with high expectations, you might fall flat in your face. So the important thing in risk taking is do your homework.
And did you have a kind of a formula or a process that you went through? Some people will list pros and cons. Some people will do that plus go and bounce ideas off of close friends, mentors. Some people will assess, okay, here's the upside, here's the downside, and is the downside catastrophic? And if it is, maybe that's a little too much potential risk. Did you have a process that you went through, either mentally or some people actually write these things down?
I would get advice from good friends. I would talk to my wife about, okay, how is this going to impact the family? So your wife has to be a little bit of a risk taker also if you have a family. But I would try to evaluate the risks from every possible situation I could. This is the plus. If this doesn't work, this is the minus. How does this all balance out? And so when I felt comfortable with that risk, then I'd say, okay, let's go for it.
Going back to the importance of the spouse there, because I have a brother who was a very successful high school basketball coach, probably could have been a really good college coach, but probably didn't have the interest on the part of the family to, one, take that risk and to go on the road. Whereas he had a colleague who's become really famous, who was coaching in the same leagues, and my brother would even beat him from time to time, now is making $10 million a year and coaching a very prominent program and in the Final Four and all that. But he was willing to step out like you did and take that risk, and his family, I don't know his family close enough, must have been willing to sign up to that, because there's a risk. You're constantly on the road like you were, and you have, versus staying. You could have stayed as a high school coach in Iowa and had a great 30-year career and stability and all that. But you're right, you would have maxed out very early, and you had aspirations beyond that. But there's people that and I have to assume not, and I know in my case too, if my wife was not willing to go on the road with me to these various foreign locations, it wouldn't have worked. And even the Ford Motor Company would tell you that the success of these foreign assignments were based on the non-working spouse. They were the fulcrum of success or failure, because they needed to be adventurous, and they needed to be adaptable, and they needed to have the attitude that was positive. And if they didn't, it was going to fail. And Did you find that the same?
yeah,
Again,
it
your wife was
was-
so critical
It was
for this.
important. It was important to me that our family was really on board, because if you fail, first of all, if you take that risk, everybody probably is going to suffer a little
Right.
bit from that risk.
Right.
And then if that risk doesn't work out, you're going to have a lot of problems in your family second guessing you and saying, well, if we stayed here, I would have been able to do this.
Right.
Now I can't do it because we can't afford to do it, and so forth. So you've really got to have your wife on board and the children, depending on their age, on board, because your risk taking involves your entire family. And if you succeed, fine, but if you don't succeed, it damages your family if they're not on board.
Right. How important do you think risk taking is to achieve your potential? Is it a must?
Well, I think anytime you change jobs, you're taking a risk. So you have to feel, especially when you go from one field to another, like I did, where I went from coaching to administration at the college level, and then to another jump. It was a completely different situation, more like a corporate level.
Right.
And so there's a risk in all of that. And I think you have to measure that job and say, okay, is this worth the risk? If the risk works out, what does that does for me, and what does that does for my family, and will we be better off than we are right now? And I didn't, I was a high school coach for 10 years, and I was a coach at the University of Iowa for 15 years.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I was constantly looking for change. But then the opportunity to go to Cornell came along, and I was getting frustrated with the recruiting process the way it was. So that looked attractive, but that was a big risk because I was going to a completely different situation where I had managed the basketball program and a baseball program. Now I had to manage all the programs. And I had to understand the challenges of each one of those sports and that each one of the coaches had. And those were big adjustments, so that was a big risk. And going to Virginia was a risk, not as great as the one going to Cornell, because now I had 5 years of management experience. I knew where I made mistakes, and I knew where I made good decisions. And so that transition was a little bit easier, but there was a big cultural transition. The challenge of going to Virginia was getting the football program viable. They'd never been to a bowl game. We're kind of one of the doormats in the conference. The basketball team was in good shape, and lacrosse and baseball were pretty good. So I had to make a coaching change after the first year. And I thought to myself, okay, where's the coach that can be an effective and successful coach in a strong academic environment?
Right.
I looked around and I focused in on George Welsh, who was at Navy. And Navy was in a bowl game almost every year. They played a tough schedule and they won. I'll never forget, I called the athletic director at Navy, who I knew quite well from my days at Cornell. I said, I'd like to get your permission to talk to George about our football job. He just laughed. He says, get in line. He said, everybody wants George. George had already turned down the Stanford job 1 year and something else. But he said, go ahead and good luck. So I called George, and I drove up, and we met together at the airport in Baltimore, and we visited, and I told him what I needed to tell him about the university, but we just seemed to kind of ended up relating to one another, and they had chosen to play in a bowl game, and he said, I need to think about this. And he said, I need to talk to my wife about it. She was very involved, and see if this is the right thing to do. And he says, if I would take the job, I wouldn't be able to come until after the bowl game. It wouldn't be fair to my athletes. So A week later, I said, "We'll think about it and we'll talk again." And a week later, he called. He said, "Go over what your offer again and what you're talking about." And you have to know George well to know it. He's kind of a straight shooting, crusty guy. And I told him, he said, "Okay, you're getting a hell of a football coach. I'll be there." And he turned that program around. And the first year was a big challenge. Second year, a lot better. Third year, we were in the bowl game, the Peach Bowl. We beat Purdue in the Peach Bowl.
Wow.
And it went on from there. And the first year I was at the Olympics, Virginia was ranked number 1. And then their quarterback broke his thumb, and that was the end of it. Then George retired, and as soon as he retired, it's just taken a little slide down.
Right.
So getting the right people, part of the risk in being an athletic director is if you have to make a coaching change, really take a look at your program and what it needs. And you don't need to get the big name guy, but you need to get somebody who you know has been successful in an environment comparable to mine.
Right. So not every risk turns out well. So how do you pivot? How do you triage? How do you make adjustments as you're in a situation, you took a risk? Sometimes it's maybe things didn't turn out exactly the way you'd hoped. How do you deal with that?
Well, it takes a lot of patience, and if you've made those decisions, it's like we were talking the other day about the difference between a successful CEO and a poor CEO. The poor one never gets up. He wants to prove that he's right. If you made a bad decision, as soon as you know that's a bad decision, it's going to get worse, then you need to pivot, make the change, and start all over again with a clean slate. And hopefully you don't have to do that very often.
Right. You made a good point about when you're filling a position, you got to have a realistic assessment of the candidate and the fit, right? You talked about the Navy coach was good at a place with high academic standards. He was good in a place that didn't have the resources that Alabama had, and which was a realistic assessment because all of a sudden your resources weren't going to be Alabama and your academic situation was still going to be really high. So you needed somebody that could navigate within that environment, not necessarily let's go get Bear Bryant or we'll get Nick Saban, because they may not have been successful in that environment without resources or with academic standards that were high. So have you had to do that? Is that part of your process that you go through when you're making those decisions in terms of fit? Because that was kind of a fit decision.
Yeah.
More so than get me the best candidate. It was
what you have to do is, if you have a program that's in trouble, you have to look and say, why is this program in trouble? Is it because they don't have the funding they have? And you go through it step by step. Is the recruiting process a problem, or is the head coach the problem? Well, one of the big decision makers for me, I found out that Virginia football coaches, assistant coaches, were always using the excuse, well, we went after him, we couldn't get him because his academics didn't meet, and he went someplace else where he could play. That's a poor excuse. That's a poor excuse. I said, if you're a coach at Virginia, you ought to be telling the athlete, this is a great opportunity for you. You're not only going to play in a good program, you're going to get a great education. It'll take you wherever you want to go.
Right.
And you need to sell the whole university, and don't make excuses for it. That's why I ended up making that change right away, because they had the wrong philosophy and the wrong attitude, and it just wasn't work. So, but you do have to take time to do your homework and see if you can pinpoint exactly what the problem is. And if it's not the coach, then you need to work with the coach to fix the problems that are there, then to see if they can be successful.
Do you approach risk-taking different during different stages of your life or career, or is it kind of a standardized process? I mean, is there a kind of a life cycle to risk-taking?
No, I think it changes. The circumstances change. The working conditions change. Your children are older. Maybe they're out of school and in college. And there's a whole lot of other issues that you have to deal with then, and when you decide to make a change or take a risk. There's a process you need to go through, but the elements you need to consider change.
Or maybe the weighting changes,
Yeah.
right, as you grow older. And then, I guess it's the same in investments. You know, there's a life cycle. When you're younger, maybe your tolerance to risk is higher because your chance to recover or the time you have to recover is longer. Maybe you're a little more conservative about the bet the house risks during different stages. I wanted to turn to what I think is one of the biggest issues, and it's being a player versus being a spectator. And I think it's been evolving at a fast pace where it's becoming easier and easier, through technology especially, to become a spectator and watch from afar. I mean, even today, you can create your own avatar, Dick, and you can live a virtual life. And if you do that, though it may seem virtually that you can be beat up, cut up, or whatever, but you really don't get bloody or dirty or muddy. But real life actually is at times bloody and dirty and rough. I mean, so it's a lot more comfortable. The environment, being in air conditioning, playing your video game is a lot more comfortable than being in the, I would call it being in the arena. How important do you think it is for people to be players, to actually be in the arena of life versus being a spectator?
I guess it depends on what your goals and objectives are. If your goal is just to get to a certain amount of savings or earnings and then retire and just kind of relax and do nothing, or if you're motivated to do what you can to make things around you better, to help people live better lives, to have a better chance of being successful, then you need to be a player and stay in the game. And your goals might change from year to year depending on what you're doing, but it depends on what your motivation is and how much interest you have in seeing changes being made that are positive, that are going to give people a better life or better working conditions. And to me, that was never a hard decision to make. I needed to be active. I felt I had a mission that I could be effective in helping people improve their lives and improve their families and so forth. And I wanted to be a part of that. I didn't want to just sit back and let things go. I wanted to make the changes that I thought would be effective. And not necessarily for myself, but being able to be involved and have an impact on somebody's life was important to me. And that's why it was all through with managing large groups. Consulting was really attractive to me, and I devoted my time to that because I could help people. And in one situation, I not only worked with their staff, but I worked with about a dozen of young people that they thought had good future potential. And in that company there, they didn't have a person that they thought could at least be promoted twice in their organization. Then they didn't want that person. They had to have somebody that they felt had the ability and the interest and the desire to be promoted at least twice and maybe eventually even higher. And so I worked with those people, and And the challenge was not only helping them improve their business skills, but they were all of an age where they were 28 to 32, starting their families and so forth. And I would focus, I'd spend an hour, have an hour session with them, and I'd spend 45 minutes, part of that time, having them tell me what their challenges were at the moment and what they were doing. And then the last 15 minutes, I'd focus on their spiritual values and their family values and the importance of being sure that their children grow up knowing the Lord and so forth. And I was encouraged to do that by the CEO. And so that proved to be very productive and interesting. So the consulting just with the CEO on several occasions took me even to a different level within that company to work with people they had.
You're in the game, you're in the arena, you're going to get knocked down from time to time. How do you mentally get yourself back up? What gets you back up? How do you get back up when you get knocked down?
Yeah, I was never somebody to stay down very long. I would find something that I could get back up and do that would get me energized again. I never looked at the negative side of it. I knew that there were always going to be ups and downs and challenges. And this is where I think it's so important that in our lives that we really learn to trust the Lord and understand that He's in charge of our lives and we are not. And if we can communicate well with Him, getting knocked down doesn't bother us very much, but He's got something else for us to do right away anyway. So I think your spiritual and your family life and your situation there is really important. You have a good spouse and good children. They're a good way to keep yourself positive in what you're doing. But I think the important thing for me was that I felt like I had a mission. The Lord had a plan for my life. And part of that plan was having challenges every day that I had to deal with and trusting Him to guide me through.
Right. One of the things that I learned when you're overseas, it is very clear that this is for a limited period of time. And therefore, if you have an opportunity, opportunities literally may never happen again. It was such a great lesson because it meant if you get a chance to do something, even though you may be tired or whatever, you better jump on it because this may be your one and done. I think that may just be the right philosophy in life in general because you never know.
That's right.
Of anything that this is going to happen again. And now I'm in the stage of grandkids. So if my grandkid wants to go for a ride or shoot hoops or whatever, I can be tired, I can be crippled. I'm going to go for it because I know how fleeting these opportunities are. How important is it to grab the challenges that are before you, the opportunities that are before you, and go for it? What has been your life experience and how important is that?
That's one of the most important things you do to help your children grow up to be strong and effective. If they see you have challenges and how you deal with those challenges and that you can always move forward in a positive way, that impacts their life too. They say, well, I saw Dad do this and this is what he did. I can do this. So I think a lot of times when you meet those challenges, you're not only being effective with the people involved in the challenge, but it can have a real impact to your children at a certain age that helps them realize that life is not a bowl of cherries. There are always challenges, and the best thing you can do is get after them right away and deal with them.
And how about this whole concept of treating life like a great adventure versus treating it with, sometimes we treat it with drudgery or are fearful. How about this whole attitudinal concept of life is a great adventure? It sounds like you've kind of had a chance to live a great adventure. Would you characterize?
Yeah,
as you
I would
look
say
back?
that. I've had the opportunity to do things in my life that I never in the world thought I would ever have a chance to do. We had a situation where Jackie and I were able to travel the world together because the Olympics had a lot of problems that included spouses, so I could take her with me, and the International Committee would pay those expenses. That's a wonderful opportunity, and we had great experience. We met people from other nations all over the place and understood how to communicate with them and how to realize they had as many challenges, and in a lot of cases they were envious of people who lived in the U.S. and especially at the U.S. Olympic Committee. And just the experiences I had of coaching and managing and all the people I met along the way, and the opportunity to have a relationship with 4 different presidents in the U.S. and play golf with a couple of them and be invited to dinners at the White House that were there for visiting dignitaries from the other country. Those are experiences I never ever thought I would ever have. And so I looked on those as a blessing and a rich opportunity, and just move forward. And I think it wasn't I was motivated to do that. It's just because what I did, and if I did it well, there was some real interesting things that came along because of that.
Right. So just a great example of staying tuned, enabling yourself to be successful as you've navigated life and all its challenges. It's been an amazing journey, and I'm glad you're still in the game, continuing to press forward.
Yeah. Well, I always took the attitude that when I was younger, maybe I had some thoughts sometimes, hey, you're pretty good at doing this. But as I got older and saw things, I thought to myself, I can't take credit for any of this. The Lord had a plan for my life, and He put me there, and He guided me. And He's responsible for everything that I had to do and everything that happened to me and my family. So I have to give Him the credit for it.
And again, similarly, I look back and some people call it serendipity or luck, and I kind of believe that it was ordained and that there was actually a plan, because there's too many things that, as you look back, were somewhat miraculous in how they occurred in the order that they occurred, to the point that I'm not sure I'd want to go back in the situation and want to replay it because I may screw it up.
Well, I try to emphasize to young people that once you recognize that the Lord has a plan for your life and you develop that personal relationship with Jesus, you're going to have all the support you need if you keep your focus in the right place. And then life will become a true adventure for you.
Right. Couldn't say it any better. Thanks, Dick.